Suicide Boys have to be one of the most respected underground rap groups of all time. Personally, I've never been super into them or their music, but all the requests that I got for this video, on top of a lot of people I know in real life really loving them, I knew there had to be something special about these two. I apologize for not mentioning them in the SoundCloud video, but it was just honestly because I didn't know a lot about them until I started researching, but now that I have, I know that they're on a lot bigger of a level than I ever expected. How did they manage to rise to fame, take over the underground, and touch the hearts of millions? Well, let's find out by looking at the life story of the Suicide Boys. The group is comprised of two cousins, Ruby the Cherry and Scrim. Scrim is the older of them, being born in 1989, while Cherry was born in 1990. They were both born and raised in New Orleans in a predominantly black neighborhood, and they were exposed to rap music pretty early on because of this, but both of them were too afraid to rap initially because they were afraid to be seen as corny white boys. From a young age, their moms would always try to keep them away from each other, as when they were together, chaos was always sure to follow. Cherry was also taught to play the violin and drums at a young age and would use the skills that he picked up in his childhood to start a punk band at the age of 13. He would play local shows around his area, but most of them weren't paid gigs, and his bands never really were able to pick up much steam. After 12 years of not getting big, he was getting very tired of trying. Meanwhile, at the same time, Scrim was pursuing a career as a DJ, performing at local clubs and picking up a bit of traction. He would also start to produce beats around the same time. He even produced a few mixtapes on his own with beats and vocals by him, like Narcotics Anonymous and Patron Saint of All Things Totally Fucked. That is really hard to say. These albums would get him noticed by a small label who signed him on. Fortunately, he was only really producing for other people around that time. He wasn't able to make his own songs, so it really wasn't paying off for him as a musical artist, just as a producer. He was also selling drugs on the side, and between his two side hustles, he was also working a job at a furniture store where he would start to gain quite a bit of money, and he would spend this money on tattoos, eventually filling both his arms up and moving on to his hands. Of course, in that line of work, they don't really appreciate you having tattoos on your hands, as it's seen as unprofessional, so once he got his hands tattooed, his job would fire him. Around the same time, Cherry had just graduated from college and was given an advanced camera as a graduation gift. Ruby still really wanted to make music, so he decided to hit up his cousin and start making tracks together. Two of them felt really lost in life and didn't want to spend their days wasting away at a 9 to 5, so they made a blood pact. If they weren't famous by the age of 30, they would delete themselves. After that, they had no other option but to go full force into music. They started promoting their music in the local scene for about a year's time, attempting to gain a buzz, but the area wasn't really fucking with their sound. One thing you gotta know as an artist is that your local scene will never fuck with your music first. You usually have to gain a buzz somewhere else before they'll really start hopping on the bandwagon. With no luck finding an audience in their home state, they decided to take to the internet to gain an audience. This is where they would discover the app known as SoundCloud, where they would begin uploading non-stop tracks on the app, dropping one song every week before combining all 4 tracks into one EP at the end of the month. They continued this process every month throughout the entire year, and after it was all over, they had 10 EPs under their belt and a fan base that was really riding with them. It was a really smart way for them to handle things because they were building up a fan base one by one for people who really rode with them. They didn't really have that big blow up moment yet, but when they did, they were sure to have people that would ride with them no matter what. The music really dabbled in a lot of dark topics that weren't often discussed, so a lot of people related to it as it was the first time they were really hearing their own problems spoken out loud on a track. They also used that aforementioned video camera to create a lot of music videos for the tracks they had dropped, which helped their fanbase relate to them even more as they were finally seeing the faces behind the music. They continued this strategy into 2016 when they managed to link up with a fellow up-and-coming artist known as Puya and create a mixtape together called Southside Suicide. This tape would blow up overnight, and it was a great thing for the Suicide Boys to blow up off a whole mixtape instead of just one song because it could help their music get ingrained in fans' heads, and with the prior 10 mixtapes already created, the new fanbase had a lot to listen to. Fortunately, not all was well, as Scrim was actually becoming heavily addicted to painkillers, eventually moving from oxycodone to full-on heroin. He would attempt to hide his addiction from Ruby for a while, but since the boys worked so closely together, it was almost impossible for him to do. This led to Ruby later finding out that he was addicted and telling him that if he didn't get sober, they would have to break up the group. This would lead to Scrim being sober for a small amount of time, but it wouldn't last long. As the year went on, the boys would continue to drop some pretty huge projects, like Dark Side of the Clouds and Eternal Grey. These two projects would push them to new heights and land them a countrywide tour where they played packed out shows every night. The music they were making was so new to people at the time that hearing it live made them go absolutely nuts. Eventually, Ruby started to go harder on the drugs as well, and the rockstar lifestyle really started to kick in as both of them would really start going hard on drugs. The two of them would have stints of sobriety followed by relapse over and over again, and unfortunately the two of them would relapse on heroin on the exact same day. This is when they decided to make one of the realest songs they ever dropped, Low Key. On this track, they would rap about their struggles they had with depression, anxiety, self-hatred, and drug abuse. All these themes weren't often discussed at the time, so fans of Suicide Boys would attach to it heavily. This track only helped strengthen their fan base, and the connection between the boys and the fans was unmatched by any other musical artist at the time. They would then follow that track up with a No Jumper interview in late 2015 that many people would describe as legendary. 2016 would be an insane year for them. Started off with the release of their mixtape Radical Suicide that actually ended up charting, which is absolutely insane as they were heavily underground at the time and no underground act could ever break the the charts. They had no industry backing to boot. This release went so far only off the backs of the connections they made with their fans. It even hit number 17, and it wasn't even an album, it was actually just a mixtape. At this point, the boys had cemented their place in the game, but they wouldn't stop there. They continued touring and working on their debut album, I Want to Die in New Orleans. A whole year would pass without a lot of new music from the boys, so this would build the hype to an insane level from the fan base. This was going to be their first commercial album, and would put their foot in the door to becoming mainstream. It finally dropped and went crazy, hitting number 9 on the Billboard Hot 100 and maintaining the spot for 17 whole weeks. It was even partially produced by Juicy J at 36 Mafia. They formed a connection with Jay and would even sample him heavily, which seemed great at the time, but it would lead to issues down the road. Unfortunately, in 2018, Scrim's drug addiction had gotten to an uncontrollable level, and he was starting to mix so many drugs together that he was barely lucid. Things were growing worse by the day, and Cherry had to do something, so he decided to distance himself from his cousin, as he couldn't stand to watch him suffer anymore. Being an addict himself, he knew being around Scrim was only going to make him want to do drugs even more than he already did, so he knew the best thing to do was just give him some time and space. This would lead Scrim to walk out on the group completely, and he would move all the way back to LA, where he would become so miserable over time that he decided he had to detox, and he did it all himself. Fortunately, the detox seemed to be really dangerous for him, so he decided to go to a full-on rehab in 2019, kicking his opioid addiction once and for all. On the other hand though, Cherry's addiction was getting worse and worse. He was becoming a huge asshole, and his team knew he had to go to rehab. They would force him to go, and he would kick and scream the entire way. But after going and getting sober, he found the experience was life-changing. After a 9-month break from the Suicide Boys and a sober head, the two of them would go back to work, dropping more tracks and music videos. 2020, their music would elevate to the next level when it would start to pop off on TikTok, which of course they didn't like very much, but it led to more success overall, as their track, To Those I Love, Thanks for Sticking Around, finally went platinum. Things weren't all good for the boys though, as Juicy J would actually attempt to sue them, claiming they stole songs from him and wouldn't even pay for samples. Even Jay Green hopped on this, claiming he was robbed of his laptop on tour and they turned his tracks on the hard drive into their own songs. Boys would have to settle out of court for an unknown amount of money, and unfortunately that bridge was burnt between them and the Mafia. Some more bad news would come down the pipeline when their song Antarctica would have to be removed from all streaming platformers after the person they sampled it from, Deadmau5, would send them a cease and desist. Up until this point, the boys were fully independent, gaining all the success by only using distribution deals, meaning they kept 90% of all the money they made off their music. This would all change in 2021 though, when they would sign an 8-figure deal with a label known as The Orchard. They then followed that up with a sold-out tour, selling 500,000 tickets and selling out arenas all over the country. You know how insane that is? Lil Baby can't even sell out one stadium, but these guys did it all over the country. After their tour wrapped up, they dropped their second studio album known as Long-Term Effects of Suffering, which peaked at number 7 on the Billboard Hot 100. That was a pretty big success for them, but it wasn't until 2022 when they would drop their third studio album, Sing Me a Lullaby, My Sweet Temptation, that they would finally get their first number 1 album on the Billboard Hot 100. Number 1 album from 2 independent underground artists is unheard of. It just goes to show that with a real fan base, you can do many things that other rappers can't. That mainstream attention will pass you by, but if you can keep building your fan base bigger and bigger over time, you can never be stopped. Many rappers get a few minutes of fame, gaining fans who will drop them as soon as the next best thing comes along. When it comes to the Suicide Boys, that's just not the case, as they managed to stay relevant for almost 10 years at this point, and not only that, but they grow bigger by the day. Probably one of the most successful groups in rap right now, and many mainstream people don't even know about it. All that with no antics, no drama, no label push, and no selling out, just pure music and authenticity, building themselves as a brand that is worth millions of dollars by this point. Not to mention the respect of fans all over the globe for having the guts to speak out on uncomfortable topics in a real and relatable way. Honestly, after researching this story, I may have to start listening to them because their story is just so inspiring, and it seems like they're really humble beyond all the success they've had. I really can't help but respect them for that. So thank you all who recommended me to do this topic, because seeing these two build themselves up at the age of 26 after feeling down and out on life really inspires me as someone who feels the same right now. I want to work as hard as I can to be the best I can, and hopefully someday I'll be able to build something even a quarter as amazing as what they built for themselves. It's great to see they built it all just by being themselves, past their vices, past their problems, past their issues. They built something amazing, and I have to respect them for that. So shout out the Suicide Boys for real. So shout out Knife Gang. Thank you guys so much for watching. If you watched all the way through, say Knife Gang or leave a knife emoji. If you want to be really awesome, you could subscribe, because I'm trying to become the most subscribed Twisted World on the entire platform. So if you could help me out on that, I would be forever grateful for you. Most of all, on top of everything, just thank you guys so much for watching. Talk to you next time. Bye.